Okay, welcome everyone to the, I think this is the fourth webinar I've done now, building on the previous ones on marketing strategy and fundraising. So today we're going to look at these issues of strategy. If you've got any questions, then do line them up. Seb is going to keep an eye on all of the questions. And I'm just thinking, I can't see where those are at the moment, but I'm sure they will come up later. We're going to take a break in about 40 minutes in terms of that. So we're going to look at this issue of strategy and in terms of organisations, both informal and formal strategies, because actually strategies may be written down, but most organisation strategies are not written down, which clearly has some disadvantages. So we're going to look at why we should have a strategy. We're going to look at developing our strategy. We're going to touch on the issue of the board, because when we did some questions to people about what they want to see, one of the issues they had was what was the board's role. And I think in some cases, I know that actually staff often are concerned how they can get the board to actually develop strategies and commit. So we'll be asking people to share their views on that. And we're also going to look at this issue of implementing strategies. So what is strategy? Well, strategy is really the big picture, and it's about the direction that you're going to take. And it's taken from Greek in fact, and it relates to the concept in terms of war, which is about where are you going. So strategy is about what you're trying to achieve, where you're going, what your objectives are, and then the tactics are the things you're going to do to actually achieve that. And strategic planning is that process by which we start to think about what are the goals, what are the objectives, and what should the focus be in terms of that. So let's have a look at a definition in terms of that. And so one of those key issues is, I say, it's about a direction. And really when we're looking at strategies, two things to think about in this thing. One is we're really looking at the future. So strategies look at 3, 4, 5 years. Strategies used to be kind of 5 years. Most people tend now to have strategies over a shorter period of time, which is about 3 years or so. So let me ask you all, why do you think that generally in terms of management, people have shortened the periods that they want to look at strategy from about 5 years to a maximum of 3 years? What's your thoughts? So just drop in your thoughts in terms of the chat. And I know this normally takes a little while to come up, which is why I haven't got anything in front of me at the moment. Repeat the question. Why have people shortened the period of strategic plans? Why do you think they only really want to look at 3 years maximum? If it's really about where's the future, what are we going to achieve, why do people only plan for a 3-year period? Why do you often see plans for a short period? Yeah, so Rachel's quite right. So the pace of change tends to be faster than ever before. So it often means that you might start your strategy. In fact, many people never even get to 3 years. Yeah, so the turnover changes. We tend to have big changes in technology. Government strategy tends to change dramatically. It is also true, as Rick says, that that things are dynamic, and it's a waste of energy to make plans that go too far into the future. And certainly, as Yasmin says, often there is limited experience. And one of the things that people increasingly would say in terms of looking at planning is you want to keep your plans simple. You want to keep them at the big picture of where you're going to go in terms of that. So in terms of looking at strategies, let me ask you all, if you were arguing with your board or discussing with your colleagues who said, well, why do we need this strategy? And why do we have to have one? Aren't we doing well enough as it is? Why go through all this effort? What would be the reasons that you might put forward for wanting to have a strategy? Yeah, so Rick's saying, have a strategy creates structure. That's a really brilliant point, and it's one I always probably point out to me, and that's this. Strategy always precedes structure. So that means you work out the strategy where you're going, and then you do the structure. Now, many organizations are not strategy-led. They are structure-led, which means we will change the way we're doing things. We will change the teams that we're working, but you can't change your structures and your tactics until you have a clear idea what your strategy is going to be. Yeah, and Marissa's pointed out this issue of for grant proposals, a focus is helpful. So if you're asking for money from a funder, they'll often ask for background strategic documents or your plans. And there's a reason for that. In that if you ask someone for money, but it's not in your plan, then there could be a view that actually you just come up with something to get the money. And actually, that could really be true. Because if someone says, we really want to fund organizations that are developing support networks within, let's say, within Southern Europe. Well, you might not have that as your strategy, but you probably would want to ensure that you've got something on your website and your organization. Because one of the key things funders are asking you about is, why are you choosing to do this work at this time? If you've got a strategy, it's more likely their money will be more effective than if you're just trying to chase the money. So funders are more interested if they can see that your strategy relates to the work that they want to fund, and they can see it's actually important to you. And Rachel again says, keeping us on the same page. Yeah, and we get distracted from what we call more pressing things. And if we look at this issue and we think about how we work often as managers, most of the work that people do is dealing with day-to-day crises, distractions, issues that have to be dealt with. What really drives change is when we can focus and work out how we create more value. So the things that really enable us as individual managers and staff to make progress is when we can start thinking about things which are not important and not urgent immediately. Because most of the things we deal with are either important or urgent. And the reason we have strategy is, if we've got great strategies and we're working on things and we're working out what the future is going to be and we're working out our responses, then we should really have less risks that we're managing. There should also be less day-to-day problems. So we always want, as individuals and organizations, to switch to those things which are going to drive value, drive change. We want to try and move our time away from dealing with all those things which are just often distractions, things that we have to do, but often they're not about the future. So if we are going to get from A to B, we're going to have to make choices. So on this slide, you've got really, really simple choices. You've got a brick wall. So if we take the brick wall, if we think about where the first decision we'd have to make in terms of strategy is where are we going? Then following that, we've got the tactics. So the arrows are the tactics in this diagram are going over the wall, under the wall, or around the wall. But actually, we may all be able to get to achieve the same strategy, but through different tactics. So that's why we'll always start with the strategy first. So let's look at a map. And you can think of strategy in terms of a map of getting us from A to B. And often people talk about this in terms of strategy. And they'll talk about it in terms of, as an organization, we can plot where we're going. So if I want to get from Barking in London across London, let's say to Tottenham, I need to go through a number of different steps to get there. So if I looked at this map and I said, well, how am I going to design my strategy, design my map? Is this map going to help me get across London, do you think? Any thoughts? Great. So Maritza's got to read it. It's not London. So the issue that we've got is often people will have a map. On a day-to-day basis, people will say, this is what we're doing. This is the things that we're doing. The problem is the map you might have may not relate to the situation you're in at all. So the tendency is to carry on doing what you've always done, or to focus on the problems, not the solutions. So the issues in terms of maps and mapping, strategy is about providing a map that the whole of the organization can follow, but it also means your stakeholders, your funders, and your partners will also know what that map is. So one of the key responsibilities that organizations have is to produce a map and to be able to explain to staff and others and volunteers and beneficiaries what that map is. So actually, one of the things about the map is, if actually you haven't decided where you're going and what you want to achieve, you don't really need a map because you don't know where you're going. If you don't give people a map, they can't follow you. And if it's the wrong map, it doesn't matter how good your people are, your volunteers, your funders, they will get lost because no one actually knows where they're going in this situation. And so when we think about strategy, we're really making a bit of a bet. Because when we think about 3 years ahead, it's quite a difficult timescale. So if I think about what's going to happen tomorrow, I can be pretty sure that the bets I make, the things I decide are going to be secure. So it's a bit like watching a horse race. Before the race starts, quite difficult to work out which horse is going to win. If it's, say, a race of 100 furlongs, if I get to the last 5 furlongs, the very end, I've got a pretty good idea which horse is going to win because I can see the last 2 horses. So what we're trying to do when we do a strategy is we're looking externally So strategy is about looking outwards. And what we're trying to do is work out some bets. And we're trying to make some hard choices. And actually, when we think about strategy, it's almost impossible not to make a few bets, not to make some choices, because we've got to be thinking about the future. And what we're trying to do is work out the odds of success. How will our organization be more successful in 3 years? And so we can't eliminate the risks in a strategy completely. That would be, and we could look at that in our plan. What we are trying to do, and the focus is really not about completely eliminating risk, but it's really trying to work out what do we think the odds of success are. So strategies tend to be about doing something new or in a different way. It's very rare that the strategy is, let's all carry on doing what we did yesterday. But actually, so when we think about that, we're thinking about where we're going. And a strategy, as we'll look at later, can be informal or formal. Sometimes strategies aren't written down. But I would always say, in order to go and do new things, you're likely to have to stop doing some things. Because one of the things about strategies is you've got to put your resources behind the strategy. So that means you're likely at some point to stop doing something. So the question I'm going to ask all of you is that either in your current organizations or previous organizations, what have you actually stopped doing as part of a strategy? And why did you stop doing something? So think about, what did you stop doing in the past? And why did your organization stop doing something? So Rick said we stop doing things which have unintended effects that we don't want to see occur. So these are the things that happened. We don't want them to occur again. Right. And Jacob says we stopped doing primary education because another actor was supposed to start. So you can see that when we think about strategy, one of the things that people often would talk about is strategy is about differentiating yourselves from your competitors, working out what other people may be doing. Because if you think that you've got a competitor that may, for instance, be doing it better, or has got more resources, or has got more funding, then you might be thinking, well, does it make sense for us to do this particular thing? And Rachel and her comments makes a really good point, that it's to stop you getting distracted from more pressing things that come up, but also it's to stop you necessarily doing things which are at the margin to your organization and your mission and your vision. And that's what we mean by this concept of mission drift. We aim to focus on one thing, but it's very easy to find that actually what you thought was a surefire, missile-like strategy is all over the place, because actually staff and volunteers on the ground are doing lots and lots of different things. And then when someone says, well, what is your organization trying to achieve? Then it can be very difficult. Yeah, and Rachel says quite rightly, we handed over some of our projects so we could focus our resources on our primary activity. And I remember a strategic review of one of the largest childcare organisations in the country. And they looked at every single service that they had. and they decided that 15% of all their services they would stop doing. And they would go back to the funders and they would say to the funders, whilst we think this work is important, we've decided not to do it anymore. And the reasons they decided not to do it anymore was quite many. But one of the reasons was some of those areas were not expanding. They were declining. So what you want to do in a strategy is, and as an organization, you want to be the leader in a particular area of work. You want people to come to you because you're acknowledged as the expert. So one of the dangers can be if you do everything, you're not seen as that expert. So that charity decided there was a whole range of areas, either not profitable anymore, people weren't really wanting them, there was no future. So one of the things about strategies is it's trying to work out, well, yes, we've got some work now in this, but in 3, 4, 5 years' time, will there be any work in that area? Will people want to fund it? So actually, it's better to stop doing that now and focus your scarce resources in the areas that are going to matter. And one of the things that is always critical to me when I was a manager in charities was I've only got a limited amount of time, so is your organisation. So you can really only often put a minority of your resources into the things that are most important. So therefore, you're often going to focus on the areas that you're going to be successful. So we're looking at where we're successful, not where we are weak. And what I see organisations doing constantly is developing strategies to try and reduce their weaknesses. It's much better to focus your strategies on areas where you're going to be successful, and that may mean stopping doing things or doing things in a different way where you're likely to be less successful. And actually, we see these things changing all the time in the environment, and we'll look later at some of the reasons why we have strategies and why sometimes they're imposed upon us. So strategy is about your broad aims, and then tactics are how you implement your strategy. But when you're thinking about developing a strategy, one of the things and the things you're doing is there's 3 things you want to consider. What's the cost of developing this strategy? Do we have the resources to be able to actually develop and implement it? If not, how can we move our resources, our people, our time into this? And one of the questions prior to this session was about role of governance and structures. And one of the really important issues, if you're engaged with your board or you're a trustee yourself, is focusing the limited amount of time you've got where you're going to get the best return for your efforts. And most trustee boards are going to find it more useful to focus on working out how their organisation's going to succeed. But you also want to be thinking on top of the cost, the effort involved in developing your strategy. You'll also be wanting to think about the risk. So all of those things come together when you're thinking about how you're going to develop a strategy. And there's a few rules that we can think about in terms of strategies, and 3 golden rules that we really can be are pretty proven in most areas, and that is organisations that have strategies will be more successful than those that don't. Organisations that follow their strategies will be more successful than those that don't. So I see lots of organisations with strategies, but when you ask people what the strategy is, they don't know. Or it's never been written down, or more importantly, you start with the strategy, but no one goes back to it. And if staff understand the strategy and can continually implement it, the organisation's likely to be more successful. So when you think about this issue of strategy, so one of the reasons that we involve external organisations is we want to get their views, but we also want to involve internal stakeholders, which includes staff and volunteers. Because the worst thing in the world is when someone goes away, writes a strategy and says, what we were doing last year, we've all changed our mind, we think we should do something else, so line up behind me now and let's do the thing that's going to work. My experience is that when you engage staff and stakeholders and others, they will often be able to give you really good advice. People will often even suggest that some of the work they're doing, they shouldn't be doing, and that actually they think they could be doing it better. And the real difficulty for many staff is they're really, really working hard, often trying to do things, but which actually are incredibly difficult to do. So I see people saying, I'm being asked to go and raise funds for this project, but no one wants to fund it anymore. And so one of the great difficulties is people are focusing on the weaknesses. We can't get the money, rather than the strengths, which is what is it our organisation might do that's going to fit in with the funding. So remember, strategies focus on the areas you're going to be successful in, not the areas that you're failing in. You're much better off focusing on those. And I was working at a conference and we were talking about how managers get on and who reaches the top in organizations. And when I interviewed for people, strategy is one of the big areas I'm really interested in. And it's more critical as you develop your careers. So what I want to know is, what strategy have the candidates been responsible for developing? And what happened in terms of developing that strategy? And what changed? What changed for the beneficiaries? How did they provide more value? And when I'm doing mentoring, one of my favorite phrases, and you'll have to mind my language, when I was talking to someone recently about the issues they had, and they were really focused on promotion, but they were really struggling to deal with day-to-day issues, and they were finding that they were constantly drawn into the problems, but they felt that was they had to deal with the problems. It was their main issue. But as I said to them, no one ever gets promoted for shoveling shit. You get promoted for having that vision, for having the direction, for knowing where you've taken a team. So when we're recruiting, what we want to know is, what was your vision for that team or that work? How did you develop it? How did you expand it? How did you get more money for it? No one's going to ask you in an interview, tell me about all the problems you had and how you dealt with them. Well, that might be a question. But the far more important question is, tell me about your strategy. And for those of you who've read Alice in Wonderland, you'll see this quote really comes in relation to some creatures which are lost. And they ask Alice, they say to Alice, we're lost. And Alice says, well, where are you going? And the creatures say, well, I don't really know. And Alice's reply is, well, if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't really matter how you get there, does it? So that's why the strategy is focused on where we're going. And actually, strategies, we might have a 3-year strategy, but the truth is that strategies are varied and they might be forced on you. So even if you've got a strategic plan, you should always review your strategies, stop and think about what strategy is needed at this time. And that's often because governments, and we look at the bottom, customers or other stakeholders, that they impose it. They want different things from you. So one of the worst mistakes people can make is we've got a strategic plan and then we stop planning strategically. So if you do have issues which are imposed upon you, then thinking about your strategy and what the issues are will enable you to then deal with those external or other risks or the issues in terms of stakeholders. And most organisations will have a deliberate strategy, and they're going to be looking at careful analysis. They'll be thinking. Others are really looking forwards, like what are the issues on the ground in, say, the refugee community we're working with? So if we look at things like the issues in terms of refugees in Europe, then there have been really enormous changes in the last few years. The waves of migrants which moved into Europe, at one point the view was that that would be short term, but it's very clear now it's going to be long term. Many of the camps people in may be permanent. It's also likely that we will never see the likes of a country like Germany taking 1 million refugees again. It's going to be very difficult in terms of managing that. So what was an emergency response to refugees is likely to be something quite different, just as the campaigning people are going to do may be quite different. And therefore, we may be looking at things in a much longer time scale, for instance, in terms of how we're going to work with refugees or disadvantaged communities on the ground, which is going to be of benefit to them in 1-2 years' time, not just in the immediate term. So those are 3 of the kind of main areas that we might look at in terms of that. So any questions or comments so far in terms of the issues on strategy and tactics? Okay, so Rachel's asked, once you have a strategic plan, what's the simplest way to keep it a living document, to keep people engaged? Well, the main issue, I think, is that following strategy, we have structure. So the first thing I would always do is, from your strategy, you want to have 5 or 6 key aims. So over the next 3 years, we will achieve, our aim is to achieve X, Y, or Z. And then the thing is to break those down into specific objectives. So each year, you'll have a plan that follows, and then in that plan, you have some key aims, some objectives. And those need to be structured in. So the way it's structured in is small teams themselves work out what is it that we're going to do to achieve our 5 key aims. I'll give you an example. When I was a trustee of an organisation called Keyring, we looked forwards, and this was some time ago, and Keyring supports people with learning disabilities, supports them in the community. And we looked forwards about 15, 16 years ago, and we thought, what is it that our funders and others are going to want in the future from our work? And one of the main things we thought was, they are going to want to see people with learning disabilities active in the community, having jobs, in work experience, in education and training. And this was before it was an expectation for funders. So in order to make it live and make it work, we said, well, we're going to turn it into an outcome for the organisation. So one of the ways, Rachel, you can look at that is turn the things you're doing into outcomes that your organisation is committed to. So we committed ourselves to maximise the numbers of people we supported in education, employment and training and work experience. So the first thing we had to do was find out actually what percentage were in education, employment and training. And then every single team, and each Keyring was operated in networks of 8 people. So for every team, we then measured how many in that team of 8 were in education, employment and training. And then we compared the results quarterly. And then we said, well, as an organisation, how do we as a whole increase the numbers in employment, education and training? What's the support programs we can put in place? So really, I would suggest focus on the outcomes that everyone can share, but more importantly, measure. So the thing I would say in terms of that is, once you have got your strategy, work out the key things you need to measure. Stop measuring things you don't need to measure, because people measure lots and lots of things and they're irrelevant often, but just measure a few key things related to your outcomes, because outcomes are the things that we want to achieve for organizations, individuals. And Jacob's asked about how would you get going on a strategy immediately. We're going to look at that a little bit later, Jacob, but the issue for me is the beginning of a strategy is always starting with where are we now and how do we get there? So don't jump to the where do we want to go? So you always start with where are we now? What are the issues? Let's look externally. Let's look at our strengths and weaknesses. The next stage is a discussion with trustees, stakeholders, staff and others. So the next stage, when you know where you are now, why you are, so you may have set up certain services, you may have let some services go, you may be doing some outcomes, you might have stopped, but you are where you are and you need to know why you are. So the next step is, where do you want to go? And that's the more difficult question. Because when we think about strategy, strategy is about where we want to go. And as I'll talk about later, it's not immediately about a plan. The strategy is when we look over 3 or 4 years and we look at where we want to be, what kind of organisation do we want to be? And so the beginning is going back and saying, key question for me is, what business are you in? And by which I mean, what are you trying to achieve as an organisation? So where are you now? What are you trying to achieve? And what will the future look like? And we're going to look at some examples of how you can take that further in a little while. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just think, either in a previous organisation or your current organisation, I want you to think of any strategy. So anything the organisation did in terms of how it was broadly moving forwards. And I want you to think, can you think of any strategy that you think in the past was successful? And I'd like you to share with your colleagues, why do you think it was successful? So what was the strategy? What was achieved? And why was it successful? So let's just have a look and give yourself a few minutes just to think about that. And then we can share each other's experiences of not only what it was, but also in terms of Rachel's point, what was actually the thing that made it successful. Oh. So Jacob's out of the... Okay, so let's have a look. So Jacob's saying, we committed to building greater capacity of advocacy. We didn't get a clear plan, but COVID created an opportunistic environment that we grabbed. And since then, we built capacity by creating specific positions to ensure we continue this going forward in our work. I think we were strongly motivated to do this and we're flexible and experienced enough to take a lead on it. Great. So this is a good example of strategies often can be opportunistic. And the key thing is, if something happens and changes dramatically in your external environment, then organizations that are strategic will react. And we know at the moment a lot of funding has gone into issues around COVID. So that's where the funding's focused. So reacting is going to be important. Marissa says we wanted to encourage more local participation from the town we operated in. We wanted them to volunteer and support our international focused charity. So we created an annual event to beautify the local community and raise money for the charity. 5 years later, it's a clear success. Great. So the strategy here is, and the aim that Marissa's got is, we want more participation, we want volunteering, and we want to generate support. And the tactic is the annual event. And I'm sure that's more than one. But so we got a really great example from Marissa. One part's the strategy, the second part is the tactic. And that is a much better idea than if we said, let's go and create a local event and then we'll try and get people involved. Because when we then, when Marissa's organization is organizing the event, we can be really focused on it's not just a beautifying event, but it's about raising funds. And that's more likely then that it's going to be successful. Yep. So Rachel, once again, great. And she's already picked me at the post for something I was going to discuss later, but she's got a strategy and then she's got a plan. And we'll talk about that in terms of why we always start with strategy. And there's a bit of a confusion about a strategic plan and what it is. And Rick says we have strategy working in a new location. We identified the requirements, then we worked with partners and we doubled our capacity and opened up for new activities. Okay, so actually what Rick's described is a marketing strategy, and often our strategies are marketing. And so often when we think about this issue, and for those of you who were on the marketing webinar I did, one of the key issues we look at in terms of strategies is segmenting our markets. So, and one way that we can grow our organizations is through expanding the work that we were doing in a new geographical segment. So one of the things to bear in mind when you're looking at strategies is, and you're linking this to your activities and funding and working with new communities, you're most likely to be successful in your strategy if you're doing a similar thing with a similar customer group. So in this case, Rick's organization is doing the similar activities, but they're moving it to a new location. The most difficult strategies and the ones you've got to be really careful about evaluating is when you're doing something completely new with a new customer. So be careful, because those are the strategies which have the greatest risk. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do them, but generally we want to do similar things with similar customers, or we do new things with existing customers. So good idea if you're working in a particular area or client group to think of a new thing that you're doing with them, but strategy is often quite difficult if you work with a completely new client group in a completely new location, let's say. So try and bear in mind that balance. Good. So as we said before, strategy is about placing bets and making hard choices. And you can't avoid choices. If you avoid choices, you're likely to be less successful. So we're not eliminating risk. That's impossible. What we want to do is increase the chances of our success. And that's what strategy is about, increasing your success. So as I said before, don't focus your strategy on eliminating your weaknesses. We always focus on strengths before we focus on weaknesses. So, and if we go back to this issue of how do we start in terms of systems, well, the first thing is to go and talk to people. Talk to your clients, talk to your beneficiaries, talk to stakeholders, talk to funders, talk to government agencies, ask them about what's going on in their work. One of the questions I've always found useful when talking to other organisations, communities, is if we could do something new, what would it be? What would that benefit be? And when you're thinking strategically, you really want to come up with something that people have not even thought about. So even though your strategic plan might only be a few years, might be 3 years, the best way of strategic thinking is thinking, what's going to change in 10 years' time? What's that process going to be in terms of the thinking? And I know that's, for instance, one of the things that Indigo been looking at in their current strategy, which is, if we look at things like COVID and we look at responses, then we know that there may be that people are going to be working from home more. There's going to be a lot more remote learning, a lot more remote support. There may be situations when we can't send volunteers. So therefore, thinking about how those people are supported, community development, thinking about online support is one of those examples and things. Another thing in terms of strategic thinking is that as refugees or disadvantaged communities move on from the situation they're in, they may often want to be involved themselves when they're established in helping others. So that might be something. So the other way of, so it's really about thinking through things, and then we move to the planning system. But do not forget the opportunistic. But remember, your opportunistic strategy will always work better when you've got a clear plan and you've shared that plan with others and you've anticipated what the blocks are going to be, what you need to communicate, and more importantly, how you will motivate people on the ground and how you will motivate partners. So planning doesn't have to be lengthy, but we need to plan our responses in terms of that. But strategic planning isn't easy. It's very scary, actually, because who knows what the future is going to hold. But just because the future is difficult, then we shouldn't really be saying we can't plan. And when you choose a strategy, it means you're going to be doing certain things, and you probably won't do other things, and it will limit your options. And that often when I talk to people, they say, well, I don't really want to limit our options. Well, managers, staff, and volunteers have only got limited resources to do new things. So we have to be focused on where we're going to make the biggest difference. And I think sometimes working with charities, they've forgotten that overall we should be thinking, how do we maximize our resources to achieve the maximum benefits and for which group of people? So we want to be thinking in a more developed way about what it is we want to achieve. And that means making some gambles, and it means thinking about what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. And it will require a coordinated approach. But actually, some people say you don't need a strategy. And it's better not to have a strategy. And it's better not to have a planned strategy, but just to have an organisation that thinks on its feet, but say we'll do a quarterly, what's going on at the moment. Not that common. So I'm just interested in your views. Do you think you need to have strategy? Some people say it's better not to have one. Do you think in your organisations it's better to have longer term strategies? Do you think that 3 years is too long? Or do you think, given the rate of change at the moment, it's better to have a way of planning and responding and maybe just doing it every quarter or every 6 months? Well, people's thinking, because I said strategy follows structure, but at an organisation level, you do have to make a decision about how you think you want to respond to strategy. So any thoughts on how you think you might want to respond? All right, so Marissa's going for the better to have a strategy. Rick's going for the same thing. Easy to get distracted, definitely. Yeah, but let's keep it flexible. So I think that's important. Sometimes you might have a strategy, it might have taken you ages to develop it, and actually you got to start again. So do keep flexible. Yeah, so, and Rachel's saying you can mitigate the human tendency, errors, problems that you might have. And it's important to adapt, but it's important to have parameters. So the parameters, that's about the map and what we said before. If everyone's not on the same map, then the danger is we'll all go in different directions. We'll all do good things, but the organization as a whole is going to be less effective in that situation. Yeah, so I think Jacob's, in terms of his organization, he's thinking 1 to 2 years and then a complementing vision. So people will often review their vision and their mission, but 1 to 2 years for your organization might be a good idea. And I think sometimes people just put vastly too much time into strategies. The main thing is to be clear where you are, where you're going, how you're going to get there, share it, move forwards. It can be as simple as that in terms of having your strategy. So think carefully about what kind of strategy might we be looking for. What's those kind of timescales in terms of that? So, and one of the things that is a real trap in terms of this area, what I call the comfort trap, and that people talk about strategic planning. And it's a mistake to think your job is to write a strategic plan immediately. A strategy is just that, what you want to achieve, where you are. It needs to take account of reality. But the main thing is the strategy is not in itself a detailed plan. The strategy is when you look outwards, you look at the key issues, your strengths and weakness, and you say, this is where we should be going. Don't confuse that with the detail of a plan. The plan is the next step. And what people do is they try and write their strategic plan. So they'll write the where are we going to get to, and then they'll write all the detail at the same time. I always suggest start with where you are, why do you want to get to somewhere, and why, and what are the issues. When you've got that agreed, then start thinking, okay, the next stage, planning, that's when strategy hits reality. Then, which of these bits can we make reality? So that's the big mistake I see. People write a strategic plan, just focus on the strategy, then think about the plan in terms of that. Yeah. And so therefore, so Rachel's saying, strategy can help you make quick decisions. And it enables you to think, does it align with our strategy? So sometimes an opportunity will come up and you'll say, this is such a good opportunity that actually we need to change the strategy. But often an activity will come up and it creates mission drift, which means someone asks you to do it. Someone says that's a great idea. It costs you a fortune to do it. All the organization's planning is involved in it. Takes up an immense amount of time. And then you have to ask you this question. If we do this additional work, where's it going to take us? And sometimes it's great because it sets up a new direction of strategy. A lot of the time, actually, it doesn't take you anywhere. It sidelines you. It leads to mission drift. And mission drift for me, example of mission drift for me is I wanted to go out with friends for a quiet glass of wine and some fine dining. Ended up in the pub, drunk 7 pints, had a kebab on the way home. So that's a really bad example of mission drift. So let's take a short break. Let's actually come back in, we'll come back at 5:15, and then we're going to look at some of the issues about implementing strategy. We're going to look at SWOT analysis. We'll briefly look at the issues of why strategies aren't successful, and we'll have a look at issues of strategy. So that gives us about 13 minutes. So I'll see you. So let's cover issues there. If you've got any questions, then let's put those towards the end, depending on the time we've got. We appear to be on air, but I am not seeing my picture, which I'm guessing means there is a problem. Oh, we're back. Thank you. Well, I can see my picture's not back, so there you are. At least that's something. So let's think about the first steps in terms of that. So first start is, before you even start a strategy, just stop down and start to think, what is it that you're actually trying to achieve? What is it that you're thinking about? What are the issues that are going to impact on the issue? So that's what we call a situational analysis. Sounds a big word, not that too complex. And that is the where are we now? What are the things that are impacting on the organization? And what is it that we're trying to achieve as an organization? So for instance, a lot of organization strategies are about growth. So that may be an issue. If it's about growing your organization, then that may be one of the keys. And then the issue will be, well, how do we grow the organization? Some organizations are about changing what they do and reviewing it. And that would be going back to your vision, mission, and those sorts of views. But try and think of the key issues, the threats, the opportunities, the strengths and the weaknesses. And we'll look at a SWOT analysis in terms of how we can do this. And one tool I find really helpful is if you think about your organization and the type of organization you are, then think, if we thought about a winning organization, what would that organization look like in 10 years' time? What would it be doing? So think about if we were the best at what we do in the world, and we were going to be that organization, what would it look like? What are the things that we would need to change? How can we be a winner in that situation? You'll see that we've got a picture here of a race with the winner. All I can say is that the woman in this picture is clearly a super champion runner, because she's managed to win this race in high heels, which is really impressive, I think. But nonetheless, think about, what is it that success looks like to you? And that means looking at your vision, your mission, and it focuses on the external environment. And the big question to ask is, what should you be doing? Now, the should you is the most important factor in terms of that. So what is it that you think you should be doing? And it's the should. And then the same question will follow once you've got a strategy, which is, why should we continue doing this? So you're really going to be focused on the not doing things better necessarily, but if additional work comes along, why should you actually be doing it? And as I said earlier, I focus on outcomes and values as well, in terms of thinking about what are the outcomes you want to achieve. And one of the key issues for most organizations is being financially resilient, growing, and identifying any major weaknesses. But then once you have those weaknesses, trying to focus on what the strengths are and how you eliminate your weaknesses. But as I said before, don't dwell too much on weaknesses, because if you change your strategy, the things that may be a weakness may no longer be relevant to you. And Pareto talks about, you may have heard this before, the 80-20 principle. And I think this is a really good way of thinking about work and thinking about strategy and thinking what you're focusing on. And what Pareto said is, if we think about 20% of the issues and we think about the things that are most important to us, these are the things that are likely to lead to 80% of the advantages and improving things that we do. So work out what are the key issues that you are trying to address, and then focus on how you're going to, what they're going to achieve for you. So don't focus on the 20% of the weaknesses. So when you're looking at strategy, you're not just looking at what your vision and mission is, but you're really thinking about how you can create strategic aims to position your organization successfully. What are the big issues that are going to help you in the future? So let me ask you then, in terms of the, and that's why strategies really focus on the things that are going to make a big difference. That's why we separate strategy from planning. We don't want to get immersed in the details of planning and what we're already doing. We want to be thinking about whether we should be doing it at all. Those are the big questions before you even start looking, and that's far more relevant than how we should be doing it. So I'd ask you, what do you think the big issues are at the moment, either in your organizations externally, that are going to give you those big changes? So what are the issues you'll focus on that will lead to the biggest changes, the biggest improvements in your performance? Maybe, and also, what are the things that might dramatically increase your fundraising? All right, so Rachel's saying that one of the biggest problems is registration certification. It's so, and it's a very external. We look for, so this is an example where you've got imposed strategy. So where you've got imposed strategy, you have to respond to that, the barriers and the issues that you've got. So therefore, having done that, having known that's going to be the case, then the strategy is likely to be around how do we ensure we meet these registration certification requirements. And that can also be about campaigning and changing things, or sometimes strategies will involve working with partners. So you might be able to partner with organizations that have that registration certification. But it's a problem. It requires a strategy, a change in the way you do things often, and where you put your resources in to change that. Have you got any others coming in? Whilst we wait for the others to come in, I'll just go over Indigo, an example in terms of changing strategy, which was based in, so we get strategies which may be imposed on us, but we also get strategy changes which come internally from operational feedback and information. So one of the ways in which you develop strategy is by evaluating what's successful and what isn't. And as I said before, often we reach a point where things are weak, or there's no market or no funding. And so we want to remove ourselves from that market and focus on what's successful. And in Indigo's case, they had two main areas of work. One in their community development teams, where they supported people all over the world to help in projects. And then obviously in recent years, they were doing more and more work with refugees. The success rate in placing people interested in volunteering in community development from first contact to whether people went on was 3%. The success rate in placing people in refugees projects was over 30%. So we've got a 10 times higher success rate. So you can see in relation to that, the community development was a weakness. And rather than focus on saying getting that to 6%, became very clear to the organization that the focus should be on stopping the community development and switching to the work with refugees. And also, it clearly, in terms of that, required discussion with staff, volunteers, and the staff were very supportive because, of course, they could see that lots of their effort was going in for not a lot of return, and they Yeah, I think, this issue about how we change and the things that we can do. I know this was an issue for Indigo in that, they ended up doing a lot more work in terms of switching from working directly, placing volunteers, to supporting staff on the ground and helping them through psychotherapy and social contacts. The other thing they did was focus more on placing people in the medical situations where volunteers were still being looked for. So, sometimes the problem may be that we don't really have any response in terms of that. But so that's only a couple of examples in terms of that we can't reach people on the ground. But I just want to touch on the issue of a SWOT analysis, because the one way of starting your strategy is to carry out a SWOT analysis. The reason I'll cover this is everyone's probably heard of it, but actually most people get it completely wrong. And that's because most people just say, what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities? You then get this really, really long list and you think, what on earth are we going to do with all this now? And in fact, some SWOT analysis I've seen, they just seem to come up with, we just have to think of something. So sometimes they say, we haven't got many strengths, well, we must think of something, or I'm not sure about, got lots of opportunities, maybe weaknesses, don't know, got a few, maybe we need to have 6 in each column. And that's not the way to do it. And SWOT analysis is really useful. But what's useful about it is it's about enabling you to work out your internal issues and your external issues. So you see on this diagram, we've got internal issues on the left-hand side, and we've got strengths and we've got weaknesses. Now they are both internal. And on the other side, the external analysis, we've got opportunities and threats. So the model's designed so that you focus inwardly for internal and externally for opportunities and threats. And you can see that if you didn't really have that and you mix it all up, it's quite difficult to be strategic, because so when you start your strategic plan, you really want to know threats and opportunities. So, and when we're looking at this issue of threats and opportunities, companies and organization, we really want to think about the barriers that we've got, the opportunities that are available. And the opportunities are all the things that might be possible. And opportunities will also relate to where you have competitors' weaknesses. So when we look at a SWOT analysis, it's a really good way of thinking about what our strategies might be. And threats are all those sorts of things which may become barriers in terms of the areas that you're working in. And so you'll see here, it's an example of a SWOT matrix. And so you'll see that what we've got is internal factors and external factors. So, and the other thing I'd say about SWOT analysis is when you do your SWOT analysis, think about when you, in each one of the boxes, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, think about which ones are the most important. So don't put things in a box simply because you've got a few bullet points missing. Only put things in a box which are things which you need to respond to. If you don't need to respond to it, don't put it in the box. And then work out which are the most important ones, and then act on the important ones, and then think about whether you need to act on the lesser ones. So a SWOT analysis is a really good way of moving you forwards, but only if we do that in terms of thinking about internal, external. And the other major weakness I find in SWOT analysis is no one's asked a question. So people will say, we should do a SWOT for our organization. Well, that doesn't really help you unless you ask a question, because it's kind of like, we're back to this, where are you going? And then the answer is, I don't really know where I'm going. So for instance, you might ask the question, how can we maximize our funding? Or you might say, how can we develop our work in terms of in, let's say, Southern Europe? So you might have more than one SWOT analysis because you'll have different questions. So the more specific the question, the more useful the SWOT analysis is. And of course, the great thing about the SWOT analysis is you're not reliant really on having to do a very detailed strategy. What you are reliant upon doing is simply being in a situation where you understand your situation. And as I said before, the SWOT analysis, because it's part of developing your strategy, you don't need to have a plan at this stage. It's just about understanding the issues. Remember, don't think about the problems, the barriers. That's part of the plan for a later stage. So the beginning in thinking about your strategic direction is, what business are we in? And that really is, what's your mission, your vision, and what do you want to achieve? That has to be the starting point. Then, where are we now? So this is your situational analysis, which is a very grand word, but all it is says, so the things that you think about now is, how do we get where we are? Because it may be you got to where you are and what's happened has changed. Some things may be relevant. And how did you come to make the choices? Because every organization's made choices. So we need to understand that. Sometimes the choices could be because of a particular founder, a funding program, it could be partnerships. And it may be that those factors are no longer relevant. So think carefully, how did we get here? So what were the choices? What are our strengths and weaknesses? Remember, focus on your strengths where you can. Focus on the weaknesses where you can eliminate them, but strengths come first. And then think, who are your competitors? What are they doing? How can you differentiate yourself? And then the last thing we want to think of in terms of strategic direction is, where do we want to go? So, and thinking about where we want to go is, what will success look like? And what will failure look like? And one of the main things to think about in terms of strategy is, are we taking up the most opportunities we could? So one of the big things about strategy is, could we be more successful? Because all organizations can change and can be more successful. And it's about thinking about what those things are that are going to make you more successful in terms of that. And then we're thinking, what do we focus on? And that leads you then, before you get to your plan, about 5 or 6 key aims. Just thinking about, what are the aims that we're going to have as an organization we're then going to measure. So any comments or questions on the issues in terms of thinking about strategic direction and SWOT? We can take some questions from the beginning. I'm just aware we've had a few technical issues, so that has kind of delayed us. So we can take any questions you've got, then put them in now, and I'll take those as we look at the last kind of 10 minutes. So one of the questions asked is, how do you actually ensure you implement your strategy successfully? So you know where you want to go, you've got some aims, and how do you actually ensure that you implement it successfully? Well, I suppose that the important thing is to think, well, why aren't most strategies successful? And partly the issue is, as we said before, is that people don't follow the strategy. They don't review it. So when you've got your set of aims, then for each one of those aims, get teams in the organization to detail their overall objectives. And what you could also do is have a simple 1-year business plan, and that sets the objectives this year. So our aim this year is to develop a new service, or our aim this year is to improve our reputation by improving our communication, or our aim this year is to diversify our funding by building direct funding, and the tactic is about then getting individuals to do that. So we want those broad aims, and then individual teams can then decide how they can achieve the objectives on the back of that. But you need to choose the right strategy to begin with. And really, we want to invite trustees, staff, and volunteers and get them behind the strategy. So it means, and the most important thing for me in terms of strategy, which is often not done, is communicate the success of the strategy regularly, and often in a formal way. So every quarter, every 6 months, feedback to people where you're successful on the strategy. Take those aims, take those objectives. And the most important thing is to try and get some quick wins, and then feedback the wins to everyone else. And then we're more likely to be able to share that. The other thing about turning strategy to action is, in terms of success, is talk to the stakeholders, see if they agree with you. Let's look at some questions just before we touch on the issue of trustees, which is the last thing we're going to look at before we close. So Rachel asked a really good question. Who's primarily responsible for strategy? It's the board. So the board have the overall responsibility for ensuring the organisation thrives and strives. So it's their responsibility to ensure they know where the organisation is going. It is, however, normally the staff responsibility to write the strategy. But the discussion, the looking at the external matters, the discussing things with staff, looking at the issues, that should be started by the board. And the way I would normally do it is looking at a SWOT with the board, discussing what the external issues are, looking at the challenges, looking at where the organisation is, looking at those broad aims. And then often then the CEO will often be asked to draft the strategy, and individual members of the board may help. The board have a look at that strategy, then think about the changes they're going to make. And at this point, I would send it out for consultation with stakeholders, funders, and with volunteers. So you've got pretty much a good draft, you're in agreement, and then find out what their view is on it. And then that enables you to do a final draft. Once again, depends on the size of your organisation. It's normally the chief executive officer, but often in some organisations, there will be a trustee that takes responsibility. So what it does mean is that in any board, there needs to be someone who understands strategy. And if there isn't, you're likely to either need to buy them in, which is often not possible, or it means someone researching it, or it means recruiting someone to the board who understands strategy in terms of that. And if there are fundamental disagreements, there often is, between, particularly, it's up to the chair and the CEO to try and resolve those agreements. But at the end of the day, the trustees make the decisions and staff implement them. However, major issues I find are when trustees don't have a strategy at all. And I think it's up to the staff to push for having a strategy and having clarity from the board about where they want the organisation to go. And I think that's a reasonable demand. So if your organisation doesn't have a strategy, I think the starting point may well be to ask why, not in that situation. Okay, so Rachel says, is it best to have an external facilitator? Our board and staff are pretty isolated from each other. Yeah, external facilitators are often a good idea. And it may mean, first of all, though, you might need to look at a governance review before you do strategy. And a governance review might look at what's the composition of the board, what's the current state of strategy, what are the views of both board and staff members in terms of that. But my experience is that when you have a structured approach, it is easier to look at strategy. And the beginning point, I'd say, Rachel, is try and get trustees to split their meetings between strategy and operations, because the most important thing for trustees is strategy. And therefore, try and get them to focus on strategic issues, the issues that are most important, the issues that need to change, rather than operations, because many things that boards look at are operational issues, and it really shouldn't be their detail in terms of that. So when you've got that situation where board is starting to look at strategy, the reason they're often quite far apart is the board don't understand strategy at all. And so my suggestion is to arrange a board away day with staff and volunteers if you can, and start to look at a process. Start to think about, where are you? What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are the challenges for the organisation? And then one way of thinking that is, what needs to change in this organisation? That's another way of looking at it. So working together as a group. So I always suggest that boards have an away day out of the organisation every year. And my personal view is, people try and push things into a couple of hours on an evening. And I think, obviously, at the moment, that's pretty essential. But generally, I try and move my meetings where I've been chair. I've always moved them to the weekends and tried to focus the meetings on no more than 6 a year for about 3 hours, with the main focus being operations. And then having the chair working with the chief officer on things outside of the meeting. So that might help in terms of some of those things. So if we think about some of those things in terms of realities and implementing the plan, then once you've got a strategy and you turn it into a fan, you will have to take account of operations, you'll have to take account of funding, and you will need to take account of the financial situation. So that will relate to the reality. Oops, I seem to have missed the slide on working with trustees, which I will just cover, which I think I've covered mainly in the answer in terms of that. And what I would just say in terms of Rachel's question, in terms of this issue of engaging with each other more, is one way of doing that is to get the staff to look at what they think the key issues are for the organisation, and also to suggest where they think the organisation should be going and what they think the changes should be, and then put that up as a discussion document. It doesn't have to be very big. And then ask the trustees what's their view on developing the strategy. And then remember, focus on the strategy, not the plan. Because the reason I think, Rachel, is that people get isolated and they don't talk, is they're so unsure about how they implement the plan that they don't really focus on the strategy and the issues. So get them to focus on the, where are we now, our strengths and weaknesses, where do we want to go, what should our organisation look like in 10 years. Then you can do the plan, which is, how do we get there? And actually, that's as simple as it gets for a strategic plan. Any other questions that we've got on strategy over and all, or on the issues of the board? The other thing I would say is, try and encourage the board to bring on new voices, new challenges, and new skills and expertise. And so if they don't have those skills, then maybe they could try and recruit someone that does. Any other last questions? Okay, if you've got any thoughts or things that you're really thinking you really didn't get an answer to, or I thought it over and I would really like an answer, as long as it's not going to take vast amounts of time, then do please send them through to Seb, and I will feed back as well as I can some of the issues around strategy. In which case, I will just thank you all for attending. At the moment, this is my last session in terms of the webinars, but I'm sure there will be another one coming along soon. Thank you very much.